Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series here as we are visiting East Asia. It's great to see you all. In fact, I could probably say it's a relief to see you all here this afternoon because, as I said this morning, the first lecture is always easy. It's whether or not you come back for the second one. It's always a little bit of a challenge. So today we're going to be talking about sort of a slice of what we got into this morning. We're going to be talking about, instead of China versus Japan and the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars, we want to talk about the Chinese Civil War, that is China versus China. This doesn't cover as long a period of time, and there are not as many details, so I don't have to be quite as frenetic in trying to get all this information out to you in 40 minutes. So we'll take a little bit more relaxed approach to this one. I try to be sensitive to the time. So this is the list of the lectures we're going to be having coming up. I will mention that tomorrow, since we are in Taiwan all day, we will not have lectures tomorrow. The next lectures will be the following day. We will still have, even though we're going to have a port day, we get into port late. So we will have a talk in the morning and then one in the afternoon around the time everybody's back on board from their excursions. Now, I believe the times, day after tomorrow, are 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, but you need to check your daily bulletins and be sure of that, because sometimes we even need to flex from day to day in terms of the exact time. So make sure you check what time the lectures are listed in your daily program. But with no lectures tomorrow, when we come back the following day, we will talk about the religions of Japan. There's some fascinating aspects of, you may think you know about Buddhism. You may find out that there's a lot about Buddhism you don't know, for instance. And Shinto, the national religion of Japan. We'll talk about those. And then in the evening, day after tomorrow, we'll talk about the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa, and kamikazes. That is prior to our arriving in Okinawa. As I said this morning, the Battle of Okinawa was the last major battle of the Pacific War, and it was the bloodiest. It was very important in terms of a lot of things, including the decision whether or not to proceed with the dropping of the atomic weapons on Japan, and we'll get into that a little bit. In fact, if you are staying on after this for the next voyage, as we go from Beijing to Yokohama, I will actually give a talk on the start of the nuclear age, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we'll get into that in a little more detail if you're sticking around. If you were not planning to stick around, you could still probably find a room, talk to the front desk and stick around with us. We've actually had people do that before on back-to-back cruises, so we'll be happy to have you do that. All right, China. We looked at this map earlier. We're talking about the Chinese Civil War, which is why I've called this China versus China. It is the battle that occurred between the Kuomintang, as they were called. It's usually abbreviated KMT, which means the Nationalist Party of China, under Chiang Kai-shek, not initially, and I'll talk about how he came into it, and the Communist Party of China, or the CPC. The two of them actually had an extended battle. Sometimes they talk about the Chinese Civil War as having been between 1945 and 1949. It actually began in 1927. Between 1927 and 1937, there were 10 years of conflict between the nationalists and the communists in mainland China. And then for an 8-year period, because of the threat of the Japanese, they presented what they called the United Front, where they agreed that first they had to defeat Japan before they worried about defeating each other. But then in 1945, with the end of the Second World War and the defeat of Japan, the two parties, the communists and the nationalists, went back to war again, and it was not resolved really until 1949, 1950, right in there. And so we're going to talk about the details of that. But those two phases, from 27 to 37, and then from 1945 to 1949-50, are the two things we're talking about when we're talking about the conflict that was the Civil War in China. I talked briefly today about the Ching Dynasty. The Ching Dynasty was the last imperial dynasty of China, and you need to understand a little bit more about that in order to see how we got into the Chinese Civil War. The Ching Dynasty lasted for almost 3 centuries, a little shy of 3 centuries, and it was the last of 2,000 years of imperial dynasty. I'm going to do a talk about the history of China, give you a little idea about that. But the first emperor of China, the Chen Emperor, he's the one that created the Terracotta Warriors, and he's also the one that started the Great Wall of China. He was the first emperor over 2,000 years before the end of the imperial dynasties, the Ching Dynasty. What had happened is, after the Ching Dynasty lost 2 wars to Great Britain, the 2 Opium Wars that we're going to talk about, they then lost the first Sino-Japanese War over Manchuria, well, actually over Korea, and then control of part of Manchuria. And so after all of that, they really had lost the confidence of their people, and they really were no longer seen as a dominant factor in Asia. And so the Qing Empire simply was not perceived as being strong anymore. So young officials within that empire and military officers and students all gathered together and decided it was time to get rid of this very antiquated empire. The Qing Empire had tried to modernize itself politically and militarily, but particularly in the first Sino-Chinese or the Sino-Japanese War, they proved that they had not been successful at that. They were still very old-fashioned, and the people simply got tired of that, so they were prepared to make a change. There was a revolutionary voice during this time in China, a man called Sun Yat-sen, and he comes into the picture between the start of the Republic of China and Chiang Kai-shek. The Xinhai Revolution declared the Republic of China and the end of Imperial China on March 12th of 1912, with the capital in Nanking rather than in Beijing. So Nanking was the capital. Sun Yat-sen, who had been the revolutionary voice that really fed the idea of getting rid of the Imperial China rule and setting up a republic, was initially named president. But unfortunately for Sun Yat-sen and for China, a man named Yun Shikai, Yun Shikai was the head of the military, of the army, and he had been the prime minister of Ching Dynasty, China. Well, because he ran the military, he forced his way in and forced Sun Yat-sen to turn the presidency over to him. Well, Yun Shikai started right away getting rid of the representational bodies in China. He got rid of the National Assembly, he was getting rid of the provincial assemblies, and in 1915 he declared himself to be the new emperor. Well, that didn't go over very well. All of his subordinates, all of the various other leaders in China had just gotten rid of an emperor and they didn't want a new one. So they forced him to abdicate in 1916. While he was at the end of his reign, Sun Yat-sen had started another alternative government in Guangzhou, and he called that the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. As I say, it's usually abbreviated KMT. So there was an alternate body already started up when Huan, in March 1916, had to give up the presidency and all of his desire to be emperor. He died just a few months after that. So Sun Yat-sen has set up this alternate government with a republic in mind, but because he wanted to really unify all of China, Sun Yat-sen incorporated and encouraged and invited the new Chinese Communist Party, which had begun right around 1920. It had begun because of inspiration amongst the intellectuals in China over the very recent Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution, which has happened, of course, in 1917, just a few years earlier, inspired the intellectuals with an alternative way of looking at government and of caring for the needs of the people. They had great optimism about what was going to happen with this new communist system. It didn't work out so well. That's why we don't have Soviet communism anymore. But the idea was that they wanted to try to find a new way of governing, and Sun Yat-sen invited them to be part of all of this. So the communists and the nationalists were working together in one government at that point. In 1925 then, Sun Yat-sen dies of cancer. And there was a considerable upheaval during that time because of who was going to be a successor. The one that came out on top from all of that is a man named Chiang Kai-shek. The Republic of China again declared in 1912, and this was their flag here. Chiang Kai-shek takes over as the leader there. And during this period of time, after Yuan Shikai had been in power, he set up what was called the Beiyang government. And he had all of these military leaders that were part of the Beiyang government around China. When he abdicated from his position of authority and then died shortly after, all of these military leaders provincially around China became warlords. And there was huge conflict. It was ebbing and flowing. Warlords would join together to fight another warlord, etc. And it was a mess. So this was one of the big challenges. It's called the Warlord Era, in fact. One of the challenges that Chiang Kai-shek had when he first took over. So in 1926 and 1927, between 1925 when he became the president of the Kuomintang Party, he really organized the military. He took over the sort of shadow government, which eventually became the actual government of the Republic of China. And one of the things he did in 1926 and 1927 was called the Northern Expedition of the Kuomintang. And Chiang Kai-shek, and you probably recognize him in his uniforms, he was always nattily dressed. I want to get one of those, I think I'd look good in that, don't you think? Lecture in something that looks like that. The Northern Expedition, Chiang Kai-shek got his military together, and they started a campaign that started in the south of China and moved north, defeating these various warlords and bringing them into line. It was a 2-year campaign, but by the end of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek had been successful in defeating all of these Beiyang warlords, ending the Warlord Era, and bringing them all together unified under one government as the nationalist government, or the Kuomintang government of China. Well, unlike Sun Yat-sen, who had been his predecessor, Chiang Kai-shek did not like and did not trust the communists. So what happened after his initial effort to clean up all of the mess, and you can see the route, a lot of travel in this northern expedition, after he brought all of the warlords into control, he then began to, first he announced that communists and the Communist Party of China could no longer be part of the Nationalist Party. They could no longer be part of the government. He immediately ejected all of the communists from the Kuomintang Party, and he began to persecute them. I don't think there's a better word for it than that, because in Shanghai alone, there were hundreds of arrests and many executions. So he wasn't just trying to politically deny them a place in the government, he actually was attacking them. And it ended up with the communists having to flee en masse from the Kuomintang, from the government forces, because by this time, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party has become the government of China after defeating all of the various forces that were fighting against the unification. Well, this is a diagram of what was called the Long March. You'll see these pink areas over here and the ones that are X'd out. These were areas where there were significant populations of communists. But under the persecution of the Nationalist Party and Chiang Kai-shek, the communists were forced to flee. There actually were 3 different parties, 3 different armies of the Communist Party of China that all moved en masse from October 1934 to October of 1935. Over a 370-day period, these groups marched 5,600 miles over very rough terrain. Only 10% of the people that started out made it. Many of them died, some of them fell off, from the exertion of this. But it was during this period of time, during the Long March, 1934 to 35, and that means that over rough terrain, traveling by foot for the most part, they were traveling over 16 miles a day for over a year. This Long March did 2 things. One, it created a focus and an enthusiasm. The Long March became symbolic of the communist struggle, and so therefore was very important in the whole ethos of the Communist Party in the future. It also was the period of time during which Mao Zedong established his leadership. He had only been one of a number of leaders prior to that, but during the Long March, he became the visionary for the Communist Party of China. He was the one that really rose to the surface as the one that was going to be leading them into the future. So after the Long March, the Chinese gathered the 3 different armies they had and began to focus their attention in one direction. Now, that was in 34 and 35. They continued to struggle against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces for the next year and a half or so. In 1937, they agreed that the nationalists and the communists needed to stop fighting each other so that together they could fight the Japanese, because this was the time when the Japanese were trying to take over China. So from 1937 to 1945, the end of the Second World War, they presented a united front. Now, in many ways, it was a united front in more name than not, because the communists were very smart about this. They were not the official government of China. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were. And so many times the communists would sort of step back and let the nationalist armies do most of the fighting, while the communists sort of gathered themselves and developed their networks of the peasants and the countryside and that sort of thing. From time to time during this period, this united front, they would fight against each other. Chiang Kai-shek would give orders, because he was supposed to be the one in charge of everyone at that point. He would give orders for one of the communist armies to fight a battle, and if they didn't do what he wanted, they would attack the communists instead of fighting against the Japanese. So there was a lot of this sort of thing going on. 1945, when finally the Japanese are defeated, immediately they start fighting each other again. But there was a period of time, and I showed this slide this morning, when between Mao Zedong and between Chiang Kai-shek and between the Japanese, there were three very different areas of control within China. The dark area, the dark sort of pink area, was where the communists under Mao Zedong were completely in control. The blue area here, Manchuria and down into Nanjing, was controlled by the Japanese, and the rest of this area was controlled by the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. So this went on for 10 years that they were fighting this way, until finally the Japanese were defeated and they withdrew. One of the things that happened immediately after that is there was a massive rush by both the communist and the nationalist armies to try to take over the land that the Japanese were leaving, to regain the properties for their side that the Japanese were beginning to leave from. So a massive rush to try to gain property and to gain advantage during that period of time. At this time, the Nationalist Party, this is one of the political images from the People's Liberation Army, which was the name of the army of the Communist Party. The People's Liberation Army really took advantage of all of the opportunities here and let the nationalists get themselves into trouble as they were trying to run the government. The nationalists, for instance, militarily, they were greatly weakened because they were expending much more of the effort to try to fight the Japanese. Secondly, they suffered, and this is one of the biggest problems they had, from massive inflation. The cost of trying to run, in effect, two wars against the Japanese and against the communists was massively expensive. And so the answer that Chiang Kai-shek and his government officials had was, well, let's print more money. And so they increased a dozenfold the amount of currency that was available without having any actual backup resources for that. What happened was inflation became astonishingly high. People's savings were no longer worth anything. Eventually, in order to try to curb it, the Nationalist Party, the official government of China, introduced a new currency called the Golden Yuan. The Golden Yuan was introduced at a 3 million to 1 ratio against the previous currency. You know, if you know anything about money, you get some idea how bad inflation was. Well, even that was a debacle, because they still continued, even though it was a new currency, to print more and more money. So people's life savings were gone, people lost property. No one had confidence that Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party knew what they were doing in running the country. They were suffering as much under that government as they were being told they would suffer if the communists came into power. It's also true that there was a lot of intellectual dissatisfaction. The sort of philosophy of communist control was very interesting to the intellectuals in China. There was a massive amount of corruption. With all this inflation and all the economic problems, a lot of the government officials and military leaders were the ones that were actually taking advantage of that by black market and currency fixing and all kinds of other things. And the people saw that, and they saw that they introduced severe penalties for hoarding, for black market trade, for any other sort of currency control that were not from the government. They said that there were serious penalties, But members of the Nationalist Party, officials and military, they never got punished for that. Only people that were not part of the Nationalist Party really were suffering from that. And people could see all of that. And they were very rugged against anyone who opposed them. Anyone who spoke out was very heavily suppressed. At the same time, the Communist Party looked very different to the common Chinese people. For the one point, they insisted that they represented democracy. Turned out not to be quite true once they actually came into power, but they said they were focused on democracy and human rights. They had strong links to the peasantry. They set up labor union, women's organizations, youth organizations. There was a big focus on the peasants rather than the wealthy and the powerful. And so they built this network of grassroots kind of support among the people of China. That the nationalists had gone in exactly the opposite direction. It was the peasants that didn't trust them anymore. There was widespread influence in terms of because they were focusing on the countryside, the communists got much more widespread geographically support. And so they knew that they had the opportunity to travel within the country and receive support wherever they went. And because of all of this, and because there was a massive defection from the nationalist military, the Kuomintang army, there were more than 1 million, I think 1.8 million defectors from the Kuomintang side to the communist side. So that they claimed that the communists said they had 900,000 active warrior soldiers and another 2 million that were part of their militia that they could call on. Now, when they started out, they were this tiny little force against a national government that had controlled the whole country. And slowly, that started to change in terms of the balance of power throughout all of this. From May to September of 1944, there were a number of different attempts by both sides, actually, especially the nationalists, to declare peace. And they got together. In fact, the Vice President of the United States, whose name was Henry A. Wallace, came to China to try to negotiate or mediate a peace between these two parties. Initially, they said, we've come up with a plan. But every time, and this happened several times, every time they would come up with what they thought was a negotiated peace plan with shared control between the nationalists and the communists, fighting would break out somewhere else. Because while that was happening in the capitals, in the countryside, the people were still fighting battles, and something would flare up, there'd be a major battle, and then the leadership would get frustrated over that, and they would have a problem with continuing. So constant back and forth on all of this. Eventually, Mao Zedong continued to sort of the second phase of this. The first phase after 1945 was an effort by both the nationalists and the communists to take over all the land that had been occupied by the Japanese, this rush to try to take everything over. The second period of time, there was a sort of stalemate for a while. And then the third phase was where the communists, by continuing to slowly build a network, a groundwork for their support in the country, they began to win battles. And eventually, they were winning all of the battles. The inflation, the defections, the corruption, all of the things that were going wrong with the nationalist government, that simply was lifting the communists further and further. By the time you get to even 1945, 1946, when there was this massive rush to take over the Japanese property, and then into 47 and 48, where they started, after a stalemate, started winning a lot of battles, the communists, then they ended up seemingly not being able to lose anymore. They were winning all the battles, and all of the problems were the nationalist problems. This is an image of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is here in this star, and this is the entry into Beijing, the march of the Communist People's Liberation Army into Beijing here as well. And then this is where, later on in 1949, Mao Zedong, after they had pretty much defeated all of the nationalist armies, the last nationalist army finally just dissolved itself and fled to Indochina. And Mao Zedong in 1949 declared the People's Republic of China. At that point, there really was not any conflict going on anymore because the nationalists didn't have any ability to fight. And so at that point, I didn't show this before. In 1946, I mentioned the negotiations failed. Mao is using guerrilla warfare. There was a major event when they thought they were going to have peace, and there was some flare-ups. Chiang Kai-shek got upset, and he besieged a major communist citadel, Kalan, in the north. And as a result of that, Zhou Enlai, who was the ambassador, the primary political ambassador for the communists, he just walked away from the peace talks, and that was the last straw. Chiang Kai-shek then immediately declared that the communists were guilty of criminal uprising, that it was no longer a political issue, that they were criminals. And so that was the last straw in 1946 in terms of any efforts that they had. There was a period in there of almost a year in 1945-46 where George Marshall, the author of the Marshall Plan, was sent by President Truman to China to see if he could negotiate a peace. After a year's effort where they would say that, okay, we found an agreement, and then there'd be more fighting. And neither side was willing to give up any advantage. Each side had gained land from each other or from the Japanese. They refused to give up anything they had gained because they didn't trust the other side. After a year of George Marshall, who was a major international negotiator, I mean, he set up the Marshall Plan in Europe and whatnot, he left in frustration and left a scathing international report saying that neither side would deal honestly, that the ambition and the desire to control of both sides meant there never would be peace. From that point on, after Marshall was there, the United States was asked a couple of different times by particularly the nationalists to come back in and mediate peace or to supply them, to provide for them. And they asked not only the United States, but also France and Britain and other Western powers, and all of the others just didn't say anything. And the United States responded officially by saying, we see no advantage to be gained from us being further involved in this. Because they didn't trust Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. They certainly did not want to support the communists. The Soviet Union had been supporting both. In fact, that's one of the things that kept a problem going, is because Stalin was providing material and money to both the communists and to the nationalists, trying to create this conflict in the effort to try to gain some advantage for the Soviet Union. So eventually, 1949, the last of the military forces of the nationalists are dissolved. The declaration is made by Mao Zedong that there is now a new government, a new nation, the People's Republic of China, as opposed to the Republic of China, that is under a communist philosophy. And he unified all of mainland China, all of what we know of as mainland China. The only thing that was really left to the nationalists was the island of Taiwan. They actually held 3 or 4 other islands, not nearly as large as Taiwan, but other islands in that area, which subsequently, up to 1950, mainland China has taken over all those other islands except for Taiwan. And they constantly threatened Taiwan as well, particularly if Taiwan says they are going to declare themselves independent and claim that they are the Republic of Taiwan or some other name. The People's Republic, mainland China, has said they would invade Taiwan, and they obviously have significantly greater military forces now. The reason is because both Taiwan and the mainland People's Republic of China both insist to this day that they are the only legitimate government for China. They both have what's called a one China policy. And so that's why if Taiwan declares their independence by giving themselves a different name than the Republic of China, the mainland communist China feels like that would be a gesture against their right for Taiwan to be part of their nation. And so they maintain this very tense balance. Interestingly, they do have economic relations, but I heard earlier today that if you go into Taiwan and you take anything that is made in mainland China, you get in trouble for it. I mean, they're very strict on that, but they do have official economic relationships with one another. So the People's Republic of China, the national government since 1949 of mainland China. Interestingly, because Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were involved with the Allies in the battle against Japan after the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations, the Republic of China and Chiang Kai-shek were invited to be one of the founding members and one of the original members of the United Nations Security Council. And so they were a full-fledged founding member of the United Nations and a seat of the Security Council until 1971. In 1971, under pressure from all over the world, and particularly Albania, actually made a motion to remove the Taiwanese Republic of China and recognize that the People's Republic of China was the official China and that they take the seat on the UN and on the Security Council, and that was passed. The United States and some others were against it, but they didn't veto it in the Security Council, and so it passed in a General Assembly motion in 1971. And so now, the Republic of China on Taiwan does not have any official recognition in the United Nations. It is now instead the People's Republic of China that the world acknowledges as being China, and that changed just 46 years ago. This, of course, this map's kind of hard to see, but Taipei is now the capital, this is the map, of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan, here, and that is the only property that the Republic of China now controls. When you go to Taiwan, if you're in Taipei, you will likely see the very significant monument, memorial to Chiang Kai-shek and his leadership of the Republic of China. But after they moved to Taiwan, it wasn't until 1987 that they had a multi-party system there. Until 1987, after moving there in 1949, so for 38 years, the Republic of China on Taiwan only had one political party. And so it was not democratic in the sense that we think of democratic, where you have parties that are running against one another. It was strictly controlled. And so in 1987, there was a change in that. They now have multiple parties, and the Kuomintang is one party still in Taiwan. And so it's one of the parties that runs for power in that country. Interestingly enough, a lot has changed in terms of international relations. You remember in 1972 when Richard Nixon went to China. First, Henry Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai, and then they arranged a meeting between the two of them, Richard Nixon and the premier, Mao Zedong. And so in 72, they met in China and opened up relations again between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Following that, some of the leadership in China made radical changes in terms of the political system that they had and the way they handled the economy. For instance, in 1978 to 1992, Deng Xiaoping, you probably heard that name, he was the leader of Communist China. He technically was not the president or the chairman of the party, but he really was the driving force there. And so over the period of time, he introduced what they called market socialism, or socialism with a Chinese brand. And that really changed the economy. That's why you now have profit-making businesses in China that you didn't have before, because it's no longer what's called a command economy, where the government is driving everything. They began to release land to individuals that previously had been collectivized, so that the incentives were raised, businesses were allowed to be formed privately. There were a lot of economic growth. In fact, following Deng Xiaoping, the leadership there for 10 years were averaging 11.2% of growth in gross production as a country for 10 years. 150 million Chinese peasants were lifted out of poverty. So the changes in their economy have been very significant. Some of that has been because of expanded relationships with the West. And then, of course, as you're aware, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square, with the death of the then premier, the students particularly, but others within the society rose up, demanding more freedom, demanding more opportunity, a more democratic approach. That went on for a while in Tiananmen Square, and then eventually was completely suppressed with armor, many fatalities, and that was the last major attempt that they had in China to try to develop a democratic kind of focus as a nation. Oh, I thought I'd put the slide of the additional lectures on there. So this now, mainland China, which is Communist People's Republic, and Taiwan, the Republic of China, with the capital in Taipei. There were, because of this Chinese Civil War, China fighting itself, I mentioned the massive numbers of casualties that we had from the Second World War in China. As many as between 10 and 25 estimated civilian deaths during the time of the battle between Japan and China, in addition to 4 million Chinese military. Well, the Chinese Civil War, there were 1.5 million casualties from the People's Liberation Army of Communist China. There were 600,000 casualties from the Kuomintang. 1.8 million of the Kuomintang defected to the other side because of what they felt was the poor government of the Kuomintang. 7 million of the Kuomintang were captured by the Communist Party, and 5 million civilians died either from combat, from famine, or from disease as a direct result of the Chinese Civil War. And that's apart from the up to 25 million that died because of the Japanese invasion of China. So it was a horrendous time in the country, with the nationalists and the communists fighting one another. So I told you this wasn't going to be as long. It's a little simpler. Any questions about any of that? Yes?
What's the population of Taiwan?
The population of Taiwan, I don't know. Does someone else know?
25 million.
25 million? Okay, thank you.
So it's 20 million versus a billion.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket by comparison to mainland China. Yes?
What's the significance of the 5 stars on the Chinese flag?
You know, I looked that up. Now, let's see if I can remember what it is. There were 5 principles that they were ruled by. You know, let me look that up, and in the next talk, I'll come back to you on that. I did look it up, and for some reason, I'm not remembering what it is right now. Yes, back there.
You said in 1971, United Nations then represented, then accepted mainland.
Right.
They looked at that, right? And
Right.
then you said that Nixon, 1 year later, in 1972, beats
Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong. So did Nixon at that point have the opportunity to recognize Taiwan as an opportunity lost as a separate country?
So the question is, because 1971 was when the United Nations changed, instead of recognizing the Republic of China, Taiwan, as being the official China, to recognizing mainland People's Republic of China, the following year, Nixon went there. And so the question is, did Nixon miss an opportunity to recognize Taiwan as a separate country? Well, the problem is, for anyone, the United States in particular, to recognize officially, to officially proclaim that they recognize Taiwan. Now, the United States had campaigned for that in the United Nations. I mean, we had for a long time wanted to maintain that the non-communist Republic of China be the officially recognized body. But we would not take any stronger action than that, because we could have generated a war. I mean, we could have created a conflict. And despite the fact that I spent this morning talking about how little tiny Japan ended up defeating China and then Russia, I don't think anybody has any question what would happen if communist China decided that they wanted to step on Taiwan. Simply the population, there's no question about it. The economy is so much larger, etc. Taiwan, I think, is doing fine, but they're simply not at the scale that communist China is. So the United States, Nixon, I don't think would have done that, because to do so really would have been swimming upstream against simply the reality of the situation. At a certain point, other nations, and I think this is why they did it, it was less a political evaluation than it was simply an acknowledgement, this is now the reality, we better deal with it. You know, the vast majority of Chinese people are now part of the People's Republic of China, not part of the Taiwanese Republic of China. And so at a certain point, after many, many years, the rest of the world has sort of had to say, we have to acknowledge this is a reality, whether we like the political background of those parties or not. Okay, and so I think that's what Nixon was doing. After the People's Republic of China being recognized by the UN as the official Chinese government, I think Nixon took advantage of that opportunity to say, let's open up relations again. Economically, that was very good. I mean, You may say, well, China now is the biggest, the biggest controller of our debt of any place. So you may say that's a bad idea, but the fact is that's reflective of the fact they have become a major trade partner of ours. That all happened following the meeting between Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong. And that's one of the things that Nixon is credited with doing that people pretty much universally agree was a good idea, that he made that effort when nobody else was really being allowed to do that from the West. Other questions? You had a question here.
It was more a comment. My understanding is that prior to Nixon, American support for Taiwan in the 60s was due to two things. One was Madam Chiang Kai-shek, who had American connections very strong along with Vietnam.
Right.
And the second was the Korean War. Do you have any comment on that? And in terms of strategic significance of having an American base in Taiwan?
Right. Well, the comment was that there were two matters that caused the Americans prior to Nixon visiting Mao Zedong to support Taiwan. One was the affection that the Americans had for Madam Chiang Kai-shek. After Chiang Kai-shek died, his wife was a major political figure and a major international figure, and she was well loved, including by Americans, and so there is that factor. But then another reason why, through the 1950s and even into the 60s, we tended as a people, not as a nation, but the Americans tended to be supportive of Taiwan as opposed to Communist China, was because of the Korean War, which again on the next voyage I'm going to be talking about the Korean War. The Korean War was a battle between the communists in the north of Korea and those in the south who had been, we felt, democratically elected, although as I said before there was a lot of corruption and difficulties with that, and that was greatly influenced. The communist Chinese entry into the Korean War greatly complicated that, and was very much, there was a crisis period there for the American troops and the other UN troops that were in Korea. And so in many ways we saw communist China as being representative of the enemy because they supported communist North Korea. Taiwan, being the alternative as a non-communist China, caused Americans to be more, I think, more inclined to feel warmth toward Taiwan than to communist China, because they really were seen as the enemy, as was North Korea at that point. Since then, obviously, the relationships between North Korea and China, North Korea and the Soviet Union, that had been involved in a lot of that before, they're the one that sort of drew the line between North and South Korea. That has all changed. The relationships between those countries are just as questionable with North Korea now as, as anybody else's. So, okay? Yes?
Whatever happened to Matsu and Kimoy? We almost went to war over. Taiwan.
I really can't speak to that. Sorry? You want to say that again?
We almost went to war over the islands of Matsu and Kimoy.
Right.
In order to protect Taiwan. They vanished.
Well, Matsu and Quemoy were two of the island groups that the Chinese did take over. They also took over Hainan, which is the largest of the islands other than Taiwan itself. And so we were defending Taiwan's right to those things, but again, after a while, I think the pressure of just accepting the reality that that's something Taiwan has lost most of the other properties they had in the smaller islands around them. So, other questions? Yes?
In the China versus China civil war, where are the tensions around Tibet and Mongolia? Are they fitting anywhere, or they were just taken over in that time?
Right. The tensions over Tibet and Mongolia really is a different issue that, for the most part, happened under the communist regime, not as part of the conflict between the communists and the nationalists. And the claim that Communist China, that is the People's Republic of China, has maintained that those were historically part of their property, particularly Tibet. Mongolia, there's Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia, and the claim there was that the Mongols ended up being Chinese by the fact that the Yuan dynasty was Kublai Khan, who was Mongol, who was a descendant, the grandson of Genghis Khan. So the claim was that there was a connection there because that had been part of the dynastic history of China. And so that's why some of that claim was made. But that really wasn't part of the nationalist and communist struggle. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.